Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 8th installment of the U.S.-Asia Institute Southeast Asia in Focus series. For those of you who have joined this series or our other events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the U.S.-Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Zev Moses. I'm the Director of International and Government Affairs at the U.S.-Asia Institute. And for a bit of brief background, USAI is a nonpartisan United Nations affiliated nonprofit with a 42-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. This Southeast Asia in Focus initiative is a series of monthly standalone briefings that began in fall 2020. And this series aims to examine key issues and topics in the region and the US relationship with Southeast Asia and its individual nations. Our previous events in this series focused on issues including maritime security, the future of US leadership in the region, trade, energy, the Mekong Delta, and more. We're excited to host you all for today's conversation on how the region is navigating US-China tensions. I can say from experience in talking with Southeast Asian government officials and diplomats that this issue is at the top of their minds and has put them in a difficult position and really overhangs all of their work. So I'm glad that we can have this conversation today. I'd like to get this briefing started with just a couple housekeeping notes. First, I'd like to give a special thanks for the support of USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible, including Las Vegas Sands, AIG, ConocoPhillips, Fairfield Maxwell, FedEx, and Walmart. I'd also like to note that during the last 15 minutes or so, maybe 20 minutes or so of today's briefing, there will be time for questions from the audience. So if you have a question you would like our speakers to address, please type it in the Q&A function at any time. You could directly message me if you prefer to do that. Or if you're calling in by phone, you can email usai@usasiainstitute.org with your question. Now moving on to today's program, I'd like to introduce our moderator and speaker for today's discussion, Ben Dolven. Ben is a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service, where he focuses on Southeast Asia. Prior to joining CRS in 2008, Ben worked as a journalist, business consultant, and teacher during a 20-year career, most of it spent in East Asia. He was also a senior director for Brooks Bauer Asia and a senior editor, correspondent and bureau chief for the Far Eastern Economic Review in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Shanghai. We're very fortunate to have Ben and his expertise with us today. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Ben.
Well, thank you very much, Seb. It's great to be here, and I'm glad we've got a terrific audience for this subject. And welcome to the webinar, which is part of the U.S.-Asia Institute Southeast Asia in Focus initiative. As those of you who've been in earlier sessions know, Southeast Asia, with its population of 670 million collectively, its GDP of $3 trillion, is of great importance and ever growing importance to U.S. foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific region and globally. We're sort of at a point now where the Biden administration is beginning to roll out its visions and its ideas. Secretary of State Blinken's in the region right now. And we'll get to some of that. But today's subject is Southeast Asia and its delicate management of its relationships with China and the United States. As U.S.-China tensions have deepened over the past decade plus now, Southeast Asia's nations have found themselves in delicate positions where the management of the two relationships becomes delicate, becomes a difficult job for Southeast Asia. I think as Zev said, it becomes one of the very prime and most important things that Southeast Asian governments are navigating when they talk to us and when they talk within the region. Today's conversations will delve deeper into that, and we're very fortunate to have two top experts to talk about this and share their expertise and insight. First, Dr. Ellen Frost, who's a senior advisor from the East-West Center. Ellen's areas of expertise include Indo-Pacific political economy issues, economic trends in Asia and their security implications. And she's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and the U.S. Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific. Our second speaker today will be Professor Pek Koon Heng-Blackburn, assistant professor from the School of International Service at American University. She teaches courses on international relations and international political economy in Southeast and East Asia. Her research interests have focused on identity politics, ethnic relations, governance, and economic development. Other current research interests include ASEAN and regionalism in East Asia, particularly China's impact in the region. You can read more about Ellen and Professor Heng by clicking on the link in the chat function. Now, on to today's briefing. I'm going to turn it over to Ellen, and then Pek Koon will speak, and we'll take audience questions as time allows. So, Ellen, why don't you start?
Thanks very much, Ben. When Professor Heng and I were discussing what we might say to you all today, we decided it would be useful for me to describe the U.S. role in the Southeast Asia, China, U.S. Triangle, to see what Southeast Asians have been facing from Washington for a long time and for now. So let me begin by quickly touching on the basic U.S. interests, which I think have been pretty consistent and are still being expressed today. In security terms, of course, the U.S. has a vital interest, a really vital interest in freedom of navigation and in preventing the region from being dominated by a hostile power. Today, one might read China. Two of the 5 Asian treaty allies are in ASEAN, Thailand and the Philippines. In economic terms, in addition to what Ben just told you, the ASEAN countries taken together are America's 4th biggest export market, and it's #1 investment market for U.S. investors. And of course, it's been the region that's been growing fastest of all the major regions in the world, probably even today. And finally, in socio-cultural terms, Asian Americans identifying with at least one of the ASEAN countries are now 7.6 million people out of a total of roughly 24 million Asian Americans. So about a third of Asian Americans in the United States come from ASEAN members. You can get more data like this from ASEAN Matters for America, which is put out by my host organization, the East-West Center. So Southeast Asia has always been important to these interests, but the messages from Washington have varied substantially. In the wake of World War II, the dominant paradigm was, of course, the Cold War. Think Eisenhower, Dulles, and so on. At the time, let's not forget, communist movements were very active in Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Burma, and elsewhere. In fact, ASEAN itself was formed as an anti-communist organization to stop and I should have mentioned Vietnam, of course, to stop the spread of communism. The United States had previously led the establishment of SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. So that was sort of the dominant paradigm in those days. But fast forward to Bill Clinton, he and his staff really embraced expanding trade and investment with Asia in general. Among other achievements, he elevated APEC meetings to the head of state level and attended himself. The communiques in those early days cited the goal of, quote, free and open trade and investment in the Asia Pacific. So the free and open adjectives go back at least that far. But he failed by some measures to respond to the Asia financial crisis of 1997-98. The United States was perceived to be doing nothing, despite the drastic effect initially on Thailand, subsequently Indonesia and elsewhere, and to be backing the IMF's austerity policy, which put a number of poor people in even worse conditions. So that was something of a damage to the U.S. image in the region, I would argue. Now, by contrast, the defining paradigm for the George W. Bush administration was, of course, 9/11. His administration looked at Southeast Asia through an anti-terrorism prism and diverted attention from the region except for terrorist groups. They also tended to look down on ASEAN as a forum. Some dismissed the ASEAN meetings as talk shops, and there was some high-level absences at these meetings that also signaled the lack of interest in Southeast Asia. Then came President Obama with personal ties to the region, but his record, I have to say, was mixed. I was in the first Clinton administration. I had some perspectives on what was going on. He, of course, was very interested and supportive of Southeast Asia, and it was then that Hillary Clinton developed and publicly announced the pivot, even though the roots went back to the George W. administration. The U.S. signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which made the United States eligible for membership in the East Asian Summit. Obama attended those meetings in person. The big mistake in his administration, I would say, in this field was the effort to persuade friends and allies not to join China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. That was a bad idea from the beginning, and I think turned out to be a failure. Meanwhile, despite the president's personal interest, Middle East continued to absorb huge amounts of money, time, resources, finances, you name it. And I would say that this is still an issue to watch even today, the diversion from an Asian point of view, the diversion of resources to the Middle East. Then came 4 years of President Trump. Of course, he disdained multilateral institutions and publicly questioned the value of alliances and partnerships. As we all know, he walked away from the TPP. But on the positive side, if you were looking for a more balanced approach, the administration did establish the Development Finance Corporation, which was intended in large part to attract private capital to Asian infrastructure projects, thus challenging very weakly, as it turned out, China's Belt and Road Initiative. So now we come to President Biden. He came into office determined to repair a lot of the damage that Trump had done, and some other setbacks as well. He believes profoundly in multilateral institutions and in cooperative approaches to global problems. These are very personal with him, as is support for human rights and democracy. He is willing to stand up to China, it seems, and he has congressional support for doing so. Together with the other leaders of the G7, he's introduced a B3W, Build Back Better World, a global counterpart to his domestic emphasis on repairing and building infrastructure. The Biden administration has articulated a number of common interests with Southeast Asia. You're hearing some of them articulated from Anthony Blinken, even as we speak, probably. I picked out the main ones. There are three. Health is clearly important, especially preventing future pandemics. Second, I would name as measures to cope with climate change, including clean energy, efficient transportation, decarbonization, green cities, and the like. Those are clearly a common interest with Southeast Asia. And then last, but by no means least, is the transition to a digital economy. I am no expert in this field, but the issues include cybersecurity, cross-border fees, privacy, surveillance standards, national security restrictions, digital protectionism. We're seeing a lot of those issues and a great need for some sort of common approach to them with all of our friends and allies in the region and elsewhere. So here's a key question then. How likely is it that the Biden administration will be able to pursue all of these different goals and exert leadership in these areas while maintaining and deepening the commitment to the security and well-being of Southeast Asia? There are at least 4 obstacles, big obstacles. The first one is obvious. President Biden faces a huge domestic challenge. He must cope with inflation, with political polarization, racial injustice, gun violence, and not to mention the ongoing pandemic. So I also would add that because of the Electoral College and the challenge to the outcome of the 2020 election and a number of other things, American democracy is not looking very good. We have to admit that. And I think to their credit, the Biden administration people now in Asia are also approaching this subject with some well-deserved humility. Second obstacle is that the Biden administration's approach to Southeast Asia lacks a major economic component, notably, of course, membership in the CPTPP. Both China and Taiwan have applied to join the CPTPP, as have the UK and South Korea, I believe. But no major trade agreements are likely to be submitted to Congress for at least 2 years, and maybe more. Now, President Biden recently announced a Indo-Pacific economic framework, but that's to be worked out with our partners and allies, and nobody that I know of has any clear understanding of any of the details. So that's a work in progress. The B3W initiative sounds good, but it may not succeed in attracting the billions of private capital that its supporters hope for any more than the Trump administration's predecessor did. They're very similar in goals. Third obstacle is it's unlikely that major budgetary resources will be available to finance non-military programs in Southeast Asia, ranging from public diplomacy and soft power instruments to B3W and other initiatives. The Middle East will probably continue to receive major funding, so just watch the numbers. I remember Kurt Campbell telling a funny story about coming from the Pentagon to the State Department, looking at a list of country allocations and saying, yes, I guess $10 million is appropriate for country X. There was an embarrassed silence, and his staff said, Mr. Secretary, that's $10,000. So the resource gap must be addressed if we're going to be serious about Southeast Asia. The final obstacle is that I'd argue, and this is a little controversial, that President Biden's emphasis on democracy is counterproductive. The Democracy Summit, in my view, unnecessarily offended some important governments. It was divisive, and it raises the well-known Southeast Asian fear of domestic interference from foreign powers. Let's not forget that all of the ASEANs, except Thailand, were colonies for years. It draws also, the summit draws more scrutiny of threats to democracy that we have here in the US. I think far better would be to drop the phrase, this is really heretical, drop the phrase human rights and democracy and replacing them with transparency, accountability, and justice. I think we can discuss that, but I think that's what people really want, and they are the underpinnings of democracy. So I'm going to end with 4 comments and predictions. First, I think China and the US will avoid an all-out war. China is getting some pushback. It will likely modify somewhat its wolf warrior diplomacy, but on the other hand, more subtle forms of pressure, including cyber threats and pressures, will continue. Second, most Southeast Asian governments are quite adept at handling both China and the United States without being forced to choose sides. I may be in a minority here, but I think that question, don't force us to choose sides, is sort of overtaken by events. I think the Southeast Asians have been extremely skillful at avoiding the choice, and I don't see any real change in that. But the question is from Southeast Asia, not why are you going to force us to choose? The question in my mind is, are US commitments credible? And I'm afraid that I think the doubts about the credibility of US commitments is going to remain for quite a long time. My third comment is that I'm sorry to say, I think the era of establishing big regional agreements or even global agreements has largely passed. I think sub-regional minilateral agreements will be negotiated ad hoc, particularly those centered on the Quad and those addressing the digital economy. And these agreements, that kind, ad hoc agreements, digital agreements, These, I think, will gain congressional support, unlike the TPP. And finally, Southeast Asians will look for concrete deliverables. The rhetoric coming out of Tony Blinken and others, the Assistant Secretary, it's great. You couldn't ask for more. There's a new vitality, new enthusiasm in our relations with ASEAN, and that's all wonderful. But the Southeast Asians are going to want concrete results. As one Southeast Asian diplomat reportedly said to a US counterpart, we want you to do more and talk less. That sounds like very good advice to me. Over to Professor Heng.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you, Ben, for that introduction. So I'm going to pick up on a number of themes that Alan has raised in her masterful historical context of the US roles in Southeast Asia. So let me begin by saying it is a fortuitous happenstance that we are presenting at this, that what we're presenting at this seminar is informed by breaking news reports of Secretary Blinken's first visit to Southeast Asia as he makes his way through Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. So he's on his way to Thailand after just having, been in Malaysia. And so Dr. Frost's presentation highlighted some of the objectives and challenges of the Biden administration's new initiatives for Southeast Asian ASEAN. And I would like to focus on the Biden agenda for US-ASEAN cooperation and how that agenda, as stated, as Alan says, Dr. Frost says, is talk at the moment. We need to see deliverables, but the talk sounds very good because that agenda reflects tremendous convergence between US and ASEAN priorities and interests. So I will look at the ASEAN response, and refer it back to Secretary Blinken's speech yesterday at the University of Indonesia. It's a very, very important speech where he identified 5 core elements of the shared vision between US and ASEAN. So 1, to advance the free and open Indo-Pacific. 2, to forge stronger connections within Southeast Asia and beyond, working with ASEAN centrality. And 3, to promote broad-based prosperity in the region. 4, build a more resilient Indo-Pacific, and finally to bolster Indo-Pacific security. So what then are ASEAN's perspectives and responses to Blinken's 5 core elements? So let me begin with US commitment to ASEAN centrality. Now, both the US and China repeatedly stress the commitment to ASEAN centrality, while at the same time, ASEAN centrality, its cohesion and its unity is being undermined by the divisive forces emanating from the rival demands from Washington and from Beijing. But both US and China need partners and good friends in ASEAN in order to advance their respective agenda in Southeast Asia, and neither can afford to cede any ground in ASEAN to the other power. So they've got to work with ASEAN because if they don't handle it skillfully, they'll cede ground to the rival. Now, ASEAN, for its part, is unlikely to break apart into a US camp or a China camp, because both the US and China will continue to offer resources and opportunities, where there's economic security and other resources and opportunities that will strengthen the grouping and its 3 component communities: political security resources, economic resources, and social cultural resources. So ASEAN centrality remains important, and I don't see that concept as being in any way in danger of being outdated. The second point is the US support for the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Now, US recognition for the AOIP is significant because US recognition is needed to get ASEAN buy-in for the free and open Indo-Pacific initiative. Now, ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific endorses a rules-based international order, which is what the US wants, and which in turn is indirect ASEAN rejection of China's incursions into the EEZs of the 4 official ASEAN claimant states, as well as Indonesia's claims in the Natuna Sea. So that, the AOIP is an important rejection of China's claims, illegal claims in the South China Sea. Now, the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook represents a real opportunity for the US to weave the Quad and AUKUS into the regional security landscape on a bilateral or a plurilateral basis. Both these concepts have received mixed reviews from individual ASEAN states. There will be no, buy-in, unconditional buy-in from ASEAN, but Washington can invite individual ASEAN countries to participate in Quad initiatives that align with their respective national interests, particularly those aimed at ending the COVID-19 pandemic, promoting high standards infrastructure, combating climate crisis, partnering on emerging technologies and cybersecurity, and cultivating next generation intent. So the Quad in particular has all these non-security and broader initiatives that are very attractive to individual ASEAN countries. Now, thirdly, the third point I want to make is that I do agree with Alan, is that the US faces budgetary constraints and its withdrawal from the TPP has weakened the country's economic standing in the region. But if we have a careful look at the issues on the Biden agenda for US-China cooperation, these issues, a lot of them resonate very strongly with the immediate priorities of all ASEANs, of all the 10 ASEAN countries, as again, COVID pandemic, trade facilitation, digital economy, supply chain resilience, transportation, human capital development, gender equality, infrastructure, decarbonization, clean energy. While China will continue to outrank the US as ASEAN's top trading partner and infrastructure financial provider, US remains the top market for most of ASEAN's countries' exports. So US is of vital importance, in ASEAN's trade with the US. But the ASEAN waits to see concrete benefits, deliverables from the proposed US-ASEAN Economic Futures Initiative. These are the new initiatives in the enhanced US-ASEAN Strategic Partnership, the Economic Futures, the Health Futures, the Climate Futures, and the Billion Futures, which are people-to-people initiatives. So if US economic strength, which has long relied on business activities and investments of American private sector multinationals, if that strength is in danger of being weakened by US withdrawal from the TPP, and with China's commanding position in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which will become effective next month, in a couple of weeks, RCEP will become effective. And Beijing has a commanding position in RCEP, and Beijing has announced its intention to join the CPTPP. So really, the Biden administration needs to step up its economic game in the region. And I think the economic agenda is very, very important, more so than the security agenda, because the majority of the countries in ASEAN are authoritarian or semi-democracies. As such, their legitimacy are measured by effective economic performance. Thus, they will need, they will want to participate, to cooperate with the Biden administration, to enhance the economic performance. And we won't see, an ASEAN-US free trade agreement that's off the books, but US can start negotiating bilateral digital trade agreements, as Alan says. We go beyond the multilateral level. We go to bilateral and plurilateral arrangements. Digital trade is what ASEAN would like, and also utilizing the Blue Dot Network in partnership with Japan and Australia for funding sustainable and robust infrastructure projects. And of course, the problem is getting the financing, for Blue Dot Network. The fourth point would be the US-ASEAN security cooperation. Now, the all of Southeast Asian countries would want the Biden administration to put more emphasis on economic over security cooperation, because US military engagement will not elicit positive responses from all ASEAN countries, particularly those that have moved closer to China. But for the countries whose security interests are challenged by China's incursion into the South China Sea and dam building along the Lanchang, the upper Mekong River, these ASEAN countries can expect, and they will strengthen their bilateral security ties with the US on their own terms. So the big picture should be economic engagement. However, if we look at security engagement, a new positive note has emerged, from Blinken's speech yesterday. That is the concept of integrated deterrence. Integrated deterrence, first articulated by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. So under this new iteration, security is not narrowly defined as just military threats, but expanded to include a wide range of challenges to national security in the region, trafficking people, illegal fishing, COVID pandemic, climate crisis. And because of the expansion of the concept of security, that has a more, I think that will, so the ASEAN country will be more comfortable, with this iteration. Now, the fifth and final priority in US, ASEAN cooperation, as Alan mentioned it, is addressing the challenges to democracy and human rights. Although I do agree, that reframing democracy and human rights in terms of good governance, clean governance, accountable governance, rule of law, and justice, that would make it a lot more, acceptable, to these ASEAN countries who are, a majority of whom are authoritarian countries. But however, the way, addressing democracy and human rights has been articulated under the Biden administration is to address the issues in Myanmar, in Burma, based on ASEAN's 5-point consensus for Myanmar. So there is already an ASEAN consensus that there should be a pushback against the military junta, and to get back on track to democracy in Myanmar. So now this area, if you look at democracy and human rights, or clean governance, accountable governance, and justice, however we call it, this area of US-ASEAN cooperation resonates very strongly with the ASEAN publics, not only those who have paid with their lives in opposing the military junta in Myanmar, but all those who live with restricted, limited political and civil liberties throughout Southeast Asia. So US promotion of clean and accountable governance and democratic values, through people-to-people exchanges, such as the YSEALI program, and funding for civil society movements should always be on the agenda of any US-ASEAN cooperation. I have two concluding observations to make. The first is that, it's something that we know, but it's worth repeating, that in any encounter with US officials at any level, with ASEAN officials at any level, US officials must always remind their ASEAN counterparts that ASEAN is not being asked to choose between US and China's alliances, and we know that ASEAN countries has skillfully navigated, the problems, posed by the US-China rivalry in the region. By respecting the decisions made by ASEAN as a whole and by each ASEAN country, US upholds the importance of ASEAN agency in maintaining the group's autonomy, in navigating the challenges presented by US and China. And then my final observation is that, conclusion is that for the US to leverage the current momentum, which is very positive. And I would see in the next ISIS, Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, they do a annual survey. I would see a spike. I would see an upward trend in the region's approval of US, and also in the individual countries' approval of the US. Given the promises of the issues raised by Blinken in his swing through the region. But in order to leverage this momentum, the proposed areas of cooperation should be rendered into actionable programs and concrete deliverables at the US-ASEAN summit. And it's very important. The US is going to hold a US-ASEAN summit, next year. So basically, these are just some comments, and I look forward to Q&A. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks to you both. That was some really, really fascinating food for thought. And looking ahead, you both touched on the economic side of U.S. engagement in the region, and this is not a new criticism of U.S. policy in Southeast Asia, particularly since the withdrawal from the TPP. That there hasn't seemed to be a broad economic initiative to grab onto. As you said, many in the region have responded to Tony Blinken's statements as wonderful statements, and the administration signaled its intent to move forward with an Indo-Pacific economic framework of some sort next year. If you were advising them, and particularly in an environment in which U.S. credibility is increasingly in some degree of question, do you think the U.S. needs some large touchstone economic initiative, one or two, or do you think that solving a broad range of worthy issues of joint concern with U.S. and Southeast Asia is a more effective way to do it? Do we need something big, or do we need sort of a broad list of worthy but smaller initiatives?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, if I say we need something big, you have to say, how do we pay for it? And this current environment is particularly difficult. I think actually one of the most effective things we can do is pass this big piece of legislation and get this country moving again economically, to set a good example for others. And that's going to take, who knows, a year or two. So I don't see anything in the near horizon that sounds feasible to me. It is a reminder, what you raised, that the trade agreements are really expressions of geopolitics. They're not just economic. And I remember when TPP was first brewing, there were months and months of opposition coming from labor unions and others before the final text had been negotiated. And so I called the National Security Council and said, somebody I knew, and I said, you've got to get out there with strategic arguments in favor of a big economic approach like this. And this person said, well, we can't do that because we don't know what the final text looks like. So there has to be, before you could launch a big initiative of the kind you might be thinking of, you have to do significant political preparation. Right now, there's work being done to publicize the dependence of individual states on trade and investment with Southeast Asia. And that's individual states and in some cases, individual congressional districts. And that's the kind of data that people in Congress need who might be willing to support a big initiative. Otherwise, I think it will have to be pursuing a lot of good things, little here and there, that lacks the political punch, and in fact might force us to choose which ones do we really want to pursue. That's not a very good answer, but I don't see room right now for a big initiative. $102 million is what Biden has already announced. but that's barely a ripple.
Yeah, so let me take up these questions, Ben. Like Alan, I don't see the political will or the political, feasibility of going back, to joining the CPTPP. It's just not politically feasible. However, there are things that US can do that will really, really, resonate well in the region. Let's start, of course, we talk about, and apart from giving more vaccines, to the region, I mean, and helping them cope with the latest round of Omicron infections. All the ASEAN countries are looking to the post-pandemic recovery, and they're looking at digital trade because they've seen huge jump in the expansion of digital trade, that's in the last 2 years. So I would say, that Commerce Secretary Raimondo should start looking at forging, maybe if possible, a digital trade TIFA with ASEAN on digital trade, and then, and more substantially, negotiate bilateral digital trade agreements with countries that are ready for it. Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. So that is one way to go, because this is where all ASEAN are hoping that will pull them out of the pandemic. The recovery and digitalization is where it's going to be. And also with digitalization, the US can then address, the rivalry with Huawei, to help them secure a G5, a secure G5 and G6 system, that is more aligned to US, US systems and then China's system. Now, the second thing which the US can offer, which again will be well received in ASEAN, deals with China's BRI. Now, if you don't have the money, and to fund the BRI, even with these, so we'll see whether the Indo-Pacific economic framework will put more resources into infrastructure. But however, what the US can do is to offer legal, technical assistance to ASEAN countries to avoid debt traps and to have sustainable BRI projects, because they lack the expertise themselves. And I think to the Blue Dot Network, and I think you could do that. So, to help them go over if, advisory capacity to ensure, that these projects are sustainable and environmentally, friendly as well. So that's little things they can do on the margins, but these little things show American commitment, American goodwill, and American resources, technical expertise and resources that these countries will welcome, and helping them have a fairer, trade arrangement with, or a more equal footing with China.
Ben, one thing I should have mentioned is the desirability of a huge increase in scholarships. Education is a real strength and very desirable for a lot of Southeast Asians. We have the YSEALI. I mean, we ought to have Fulbright scholarships greatly expanded.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to go to some of the questions from the audience. Two of the biggest initiatives in the Biden administration's first year have been the elevation of the Quad as a diplomatic institution and AUKUS, the arrangement with Australia and the UK. Now, these may not displace ASEAN within the regional architecture, but and as you noted, Pek, they've been greeted differently in different ASEAN members. How do you think these developments will change broadly the Indo-Pacific regional architecture? And do you think that Southeast Asia, and again, it's hard to generalize with the different countries, but how worried do you think the Southeast Asian countries are, particularly in a realm in which I think the disagreements over what to do with Myanmar are so great?
Pek Koon, why don't you go first on that one?
Ben, when you say differences over Myanmar is so great, can you refine?
Just sort of broadly, ASEAN's 5-point consensus on Myanmar, ASEAN has had difficulty
right.
becoming clearly active as an effective diplomatic actor there.
Right. Okay. So let me address that first. I mean, okay, you're looking at the differences and how then they would react to the Quad and AUKUS. Now, for Myanmar, I mean, it's the ASEAN way, right? They finally got around to agreeing on the minimum that they can agree on, which is a 5 points consensus to bring back democracy to Myanmar. But interestingly enough, the fact that ASEAN insisted that Myanmar sends a civilian leader, to the US-ASEAN summit and to the ES summit, that is a first time, unprecedented. And General Lang decided not to send anybody, and so we had this blank screen, with Burma, representing Burma in the virtual summit. So that is a first in a sense. And then another thing that we look at is that I think that there is some coalescence of ASEAN commitment. Of course, Cambodia, Laos, they're always the outliners. But if you look at, so what came out of Blinken's trip to Malaysia was this pronouncement by the Malaysian Foreign Minister, Saifuddin. He said, that, because of the principle of non-interference, we do not impose our will on any country, but non-interference should not mean non-indifference. In other words, we should not be indifferent, to massive crimes of humanity. And then he went on to say that, we should avoid non-indifference. And then he also said that we had, because the problem in Myanmar was spillover, and Malaysia has 200,000 Rohingya refugees, right? And so, and then these are Muslim majority countries, the Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, the Muslim majority countries, they've got great resolve, to do something in Myanmar, and the Burmese then to do something about the Rohingya crisis with a return to democracy. And we know that the negotiations, we know that not negotiations, we know that the National Unity Government in Myanmar, they are thinking seriously about how then, do they deal with the Rohingya crisis if they come back to power. Now, the other question about the Quad and AUKUS, I feel that Quad really is not seen to be as perhaps controversial as AUKUS, because there are initiatives in Quad that can benefit individual ASEAN countries, like I mentioned, the COVID and the other infrastructure initiatives. Now, for AUKUS actually, a stronger defense, alliance between Australia, US, and the UK would actually be will be more accepted by Vietnam and Philippines if the next Philippines president begins to take Chinese incursions more seriously. So and if the US, I think so far that these objections are not in any way will in any way damage the overall relationship with the US, and especially, as I said, with the US giving strong endorsement of the ASEAN outlook of the Indo-Pacific, and then working with ASEAN within the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, and working in Quad and AUKUS initiatives within that framework.
Your mention, Ben, of AUKUS in particular reminds me that the geopolitical conditions have changed somewhat quite recently. One is that Australia itself, which exports major minerals to China, several years ago, really began taking the China threat seriously. And this AUKUS has certainly gotten China's attention, to put it mildly. The UK effort to join CPTPP and its participation in AUKUS reminds me that not just in the UK, but increasingly on the continent of Europe, there is beginning to be concern, if not alarm, about China. Even in Germany, I've been told. And even the mercantilist approach of sorts that Germans have taken is being modified now by businesses' own recognition of Chinese practices that are harmful. I'm not sure the United States wants more than a token presence in from Europe, particularly since Russia, Ukraine is the other hotspot along with Taiwan. But it puts Southeast Asian countries in a position of I think Pek Koon can speak to this, but they don't want the military and security initiatives in the region to go too far because that could provoke China. But I do think, at least in the armed forces of some of these countries, they're really rather glad that we're doing something like AUKUS.
Mm-hmm. And I was just going to talk about this, the European element in this, with the Biden administration wanting to expand engagement beyond the region to bring in other partners. So for the first time, we see ASEAN being invited as observers in the G7, right? It was the first time the ASEAN was. And I think by inviting ASEAN and getting to the G7, that really nicely sets up the stage for US working more closely with EU, in managing the US-China rivalry in the region. And the EU has announced its own, I forget, $3 billion, its own package, for economic engagement in ASEAN. And so now, what is interesting, with this, with this new, with the EU, renewed EU engagement, or renewed EU interest in ASEAN, or the new EU interest in ASEAN, EU had previously applied to join the EES and was rejected by ASEAN. Now, I think EU may renew its application to join ASEAN and to join the EES. So this is something that I see, as something that might happen in the not too near future.
We don't have time to discuss Japan today, but they have become a significant actor. And ICS polls in the region, when asked what country can be most counted on to do the right thing, the answer is consistently Japan. And let's not forget the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, emphasis on quality, the PQI, not to mention the Blue Dot Network and others. Japan is actually quite popular in Southeast Asia, relatively speaking, and has quietly stepped up to a lot of things we were hoping they would do, thanks to Mr. Abe.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Another question still in the realm. The ASEAN and China have been working on a South China Sea Code of Conduct for a number of years. The question is, what progress, if any, has been made on that? And do you think such a code is possible to formulate, given the presence of PRC-friendly countries like Cambodia, which chairs ASEAN next year? And more broadly, do you see that as the primary way in which the South China Sea claimants are, seeking to keep a lid on tensions, or are there new ways in which the countries are thinking about it?
Let's not both speak at once. Pek Koon wants you.
Sorry.
Well, yeah. The code of conduct, as you know, there has been a what I call it. There has been China has wanted to do it in the way it wants to do, right? And so we, but at the same time, ASEAN is not really, letting China, eat its lunch here. But China is using Cambodia as a proxy vote, to veto anything that China doesn't like, and it will continue to do so in all other ASEAN initiatives. However, I see that I don't see it, being completed next year. And then the pandemic was an issue that put it on, that was put on ice for a couple of years. But it will not be the binding impact. I'm not quite sure how binding it will be. It will more, I think it will just basically not change anything, change anything that China will want to do in the region. So I'm not optimistic that the code, will will honor the conditions in the Declaration of the Code of Conduct that was made in 2002, that countries should stop expanding their military presence or stop island building and stop doing negative or undesirable activities in the region. I don't see that. So it really it will be a piece of paper that basically China won't pay much attention to, but China but at the same time ASEAN will continue to, especially Vietnam and the Philippines, will continue to make sure that they won't have a conduct that gives everything away to China. So it's in limbo for the time being.
If it's not enforceable, then it's not going to be very meaningful. Look at the example we had. It is a disappointing example of the Philippine case and the arbitration panel in The Hague about China's claims. The United States, at least in Europe, all applauded and said, "Oh, wonderful, you're resorting to international law." Philippines won a hands down victory. Did it make any difference to the Chinese? No. So all of these commitments, even that one, has to be viewed very cautiously and skeptically unless there's an enforcement mechanism.
Ellen, you've said that to some degree the rhetoric and the question about ASEAN members being forced to choose between the US and China has been overtaken by events, and there was an interesting way to think about it. Mm-hmm. I saw a comment from Lee Chun-lung a month ago that phrased it differently, that ASEAN members were interested in cooperating with the United States, but they were not eager to exclude those, particularly China, who we named, who were not part of initiatives, broader initiatives. How do you think the U.S. should navigate that sentiment? The delicacy, the eagerness to have support from the United States, but the delicacy of conditioning of that support on a particular set of goals that China's not going to accept.
I would err on the side of supporting those who think China should be part of these agreements and arrangements with caveats. Right? The big issue at the moment, of course, is CPTPP. If China is accepted, then it's going to veto Taiwan, which is a bad thing. So some very careful delicate diplomacy has to be worked out there. If we took Vietnam on its word that they were going to carry out reforms and thereby qualify for the CPTPP, well, why can't we do that with China? I understand the reasoning, but at the same time, as I said in the Summit of Democracy, that I didn't think excluding people was a very good approach to anything. At the same time, I think let's take the Winter Olympics in Beijing. I actually support the decisions made by US, Canada, Australia, and some others to boycott the Olympics diplomatically while allowing the athletes to compete. I mean, this is an example of our need for diplomacy. People don't respect the craft of diplomacy enough. They call people cookie pushers and people with striped pants and all this kind of thing. You must have seen it in Asia. This kind of thing about whether to include China or not and under what conditions is perfect for behind the scenes diplomacy. Yeah. And Secretary Gates said that he had more people in the military bands than in the entire foreign service. That tells you something. And we're still not supporting that element of our approach to the world sufficiently.
Yeah, and just follow up with the importance of diplomacy, and I think that if the China-US rivalry is not presented as a zero-sum game, and there is assurances that the US, both countries, realize the importance of their continued engagement, as we see in the Biden-Xi virtual summit a couple of weeks ago, where there were assurances that yes, things are getting hot, but however, we really need to stay focused. We really need to make sure that none of the tensions escalate into conflict. And I think that kind of diplomacy, and I think Biden administration is extremely aware of the need, and so does Xi administration. And I think that overarching, kind of the diplomatic, initiatives, and to make sure that this is really a win-win, that you can get something out of each of us, right? You can play us, and the Southeast Asian countries are very skilled at playing, China against US and vice versa. So, I think that we will continue, to have this cooperation and competition in a region that is being increasingly managed by China and US, not as co-equals at the moment, but perhaps at some point, they could be co-equals, but at the moment, the US is still the dominant, power in the region.
You may have read, Ben, that as a result of the sixth plenum of the Central Committee, there's a ratification of rewriting history and changes in the Constitution and all those other things. The rewriting of history particularly worries me. I've taught adult education non-credit courses on China's century of humiliation from the Chinese point of view. I'm very, very sympathetic to this humiliation argument, and we have to be sensitive to it. But they've taken it way, way farther than it should be taken. And the whole generations of Chinese are going to be brought up with a very one-sided view of history. And I worry a lot about that. So I think before Xi Jinping began initiatives of this kind, the argument for including China in, which is your original question, was much stronger. That this is what Zellick called the responsible stakeholder argument, although you could argue that China didn't have a stake in the first instance, so why should they behave like a responsible stakeholder now? But aside from that, they did seem to be on a path to market-oriented economics and some degree of political relaxation, and that came to a screeching halt.
One of the things the Biden administration has talked about, and actually put some money into part of the $102 million package to ASEAN, is supply chain resiliency. Big issue of the moment. Can you and ASEAN is so integrated into global supply chains. Can you talk a little bit about what the possibilities are for the U.S. to help with these issues? We are, of course, not a statist economic system, so we can't push on companies to do things that they don't want to do. But what can the U.S. do with ASEAN and its individual members on the question of supply chain resiliency?
The whole supply chain issue varies considerably with the sector. I was in the aerospace private sector world in another company as well in the 1980s. So I sort of saw some of this from the inside. To answer that question, one thing I've thought of is obviously trade facilitation and simplifying port procedures. One, the single window enforcement. I really honestly don't think there's a whole lot the U.S. can do about this.
Yeah.
What do you think, Ben?
Speaking as an absolute ignorance, right? But my Pollyanna optimism, is at play here. So I think that the U.S. can do can contribute to supply chain resilience, and ASEAN looks to the U.S. because what the U.S. needs to do first of all is happening now is to as tensions with China gets more difficult domestically in China, the U.S. multinationals can relocate their production in the region, and then to ensure supply chain resilience by being the region and as part of the decoupling with China, and also at the same time, if you look at where it's needed, if you look for a digital trade agreement framework with individual countries, we're looking at the greatest need is with the micro, small, medium enterprises. And micro and small and medium enterprises are the greatest need of digital technology, know-how, capacity building, and they form something like 90% of the total GDP in a lot of the ASEAN countries. So that's where, the digital building, the digital capacity of MSME in ASEAN countries, that's where I think, where we can see, building up supply chain resiliency. And I think I really feel this is really important. This is where one of the very first priorities, first deliverables the US can bring, to the region in propping up or in expanding, strengthening supply chain resiliency through agreements, with in the region.
Ben, I'll put a far out theme on the table here. There's something, as you know, called 3D printing. And if you carry that to extremes and you marry it to the deglobalization pressures that are mounting, you could email your measurements for a jacket or something, or shoes. And instead of Nike producing in 37 countries or whatever it is with all these different products, it could be manufactured in a 3D system right there, bringing production back to a country that was otherwise just one point in a supply chain. It's kind of far out, but it's probably here for certain products, like spare parts.
Yeah, and the US companies have the greatest confidence. They enjoy the greatest confidence and credibility with their Southeast Asian, trade partners, because, they're the ones who have transferred technology, the ones who trained management, they've promoted locals to the top managing positions. So the US comes in and says, okay, now we're going to help you with the digitalization, of trade. China doesn't have it. China doesn't have that kind of track record, in being good corporate partners that US have. So this is where, you've got a very, very conducive environment, to work with in digitalization of trade that US can bring. China won't be able to do it, given the poor track record of Chinese state-owned companies, in the region.
We've reached that point in the 10-year cycle when Cambodia's chair of ASEAN begins. 10 years ago, it was a year in which ASEAN failed to issue a communique because of very direct Chinese lobbying over South China Sea language at ASEAN Summit. If you were advising the Biden administration on how to deal with ASEAN as an institution this year and Cambodia as ASEAN's chair, what would you advise them to do?
Before taking a crack at that, if I remember correctly, Indonesia sent a diplomat to Cambodia afterwards, after that debacle, and they managed to work something out. Which again, reinforces my respect for the kind of quiet things that ASEAN members tend to do. I think Biden and Blinken are doing just about everything right at the moment. So I don't know that I'd have any additional advice for them other than what we've already been discussing. Pek, do you want to? Oh,
yeah, I think Cambodia will be on its.
Guys.
I believe that Cambodia will be on its best behavior, or try to be on its best behavior, because the ASEAN, there's already a minimum commitment to rules, international order based on rule of law, and Cambodia will not, try to take that out. It's impossible for Cambodia to take out something that's really it's really very much a part of the ASEAN DNA, is commitment to international law-based order. So what I would see is that Cambodia, and as for Myanmar, Cambodia appears to be committed, to the ASEAN 5-point consensus, and will go along, with it. When it's raised in the US ASEAN summit in the US, they will look at this as well. So, for example, the US ASEAN summit, that in the US, Blinken says they look at the pandemic, they look at Myanmar and climate. I think these are three top priorities to look at. And but what Cambodia will try to do, is to have a legacy, have a positive legacy. And I understand this is some, rumors, going around that Cambodia will try to get acceptance of Timor-Leste membership in ASEAN. I've heard, that this is something that Cambodia, so if Cambodia, is able to get around Singapore's early objection, to the acceptance of Timor-Leste, and this is something that would be really something, it'd be the legacy, because every ASEAN chair have a legacy to leave. And if Cambodia succeeds in doing that, it will be its legacy. And then I don't think Cambodia will let China be the kind of divisive issue that it was.
One thing I'd suggest again to administration, they may be doing this already, is look carefully at who influences Cambodia. Obviously, China is one, but Japan might be another. And it might be that they could, behind the scenes, in consultation with us, bring about some changes that might not otherwise be possible if we just lecture at the Cambodians. I do wonder how much longer Hun Sen is going to be around. It's been a very long time.
But he's lined up his son to succeed.
His son. Oh, isn't that the pattern? Oh dear.
Right. Yes.
I think we got time for one last. One of the things that this administration and previous administrations have focused on is minilateralism and the grouping of countries with similar views on a particular issue. Do you think that as we look at Southeast Asia broadly, we should spend more time with the minilateral groups of countries of common interest, the lower Mekong nations, the South China Sea claimants, those countries who are ready for a digital services agreement, that we should think of ASEAN as a group of countries that can be broken into subgroupings?
Well, I'm a globalist by instinct, and I hope that we haven't given up on the WTO. Every issue a collective groan at this point. But let's not forget what it did for Southeast Asia and for China as well. So I don't like to see global approaches abandoned, but I have to say, I think both Pek Koon and I have agreed that ad hoc minilateral approaches for particular problems is likely to get results. But I hope we don't give up on the idea, even in the digital world, of standardizing all these agreements and technical standards that we come up with. We really ought to have one set of global standards, but maybe we have to begin building them bit by bit, just like the Singapore, New Zealand, Chile agreement on digital issues. But let's not give up on the world altogether. Yeah.
So, I think, Ben, this is, I would say that, in terms of, working, a work in progress, that you keep rhetorical commitment to ASEAN centrality. You've got to keep on, keep the rhetorical commitment to ASEAN centrality, and then, move towards unilateral agreements with the countries, bilaterally, or, or more than 2 or 3 countries, on the areas of convergence of interest. And don't forget, ASEAN is, all these moving parts in ASEAN. And ASEAN, like the US, what ASEAN stands towards the US and China depends on which government is in power. And so we saw this good change, when, in Duterte, the pivot towards China. And likewise, we don't know, Bongbong may not be any better. On the other hand, again, so like the US, we've got to, those of us who are looking at ASEAN, we need to pay attention to what, which government is in power, because that can change. And then the perceptions or the responses to us, to US and China will change accordingly.
The news bulletin that's come in during this program is that the Thailand portion of the Secretary's trip has been canceled because of a member of his delegation having tested positive for COVID, which is really disturbing. It's very depressing.
we still live in this world.
That's right.
Well, thanks to you both. We've hit 2:15, 2:16 actually, but this has been a fascinating discussion, an awful lot to think about, and I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your thoughts. I'm going to turn it back to Zev to sign out.
Great, thank you, Ben. Really appreciate you stepping in today to moderate and to provide your insight. Not easy to do in a virtual format, and a huge thank you to Ellen and Pek Koon for joining us and providing your insight. You all covered an extensive list of topics today, and we could have talked about this for many, many more hours. So thank you for giving your valuable perspective. Hopefully this is just the beginning of conversations as the U.S. and our partners work more closely to create outcomes that benefit everyone. If anyone in the audience would like to follow up with any of our speakers, you can reach out to us at usai@usasiainstitute.org, and we would be happy to assist in kind of fostering further dialogue with the speakers today. We will be continuing the Southeast Asia in Focus series in 2022, although not in January. We'll be taking a bit of a break. We also plan to make this a dual track series, focusing on Northeast Asia as well. So we would alternate each month between focusing on Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. So please stay on the lookout for more information. Thank you again, Ben, Ellen, Pek Koon. Great to have you today. I wish we could stand around and chat in person afterwards, but really appreciate you joining us today and really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you both also.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us. Thank you, Ben,
Thank you.
for this session.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Same
Happy
to you.
holidays. Bye.